it never made sense to me. If you have a community that say it's a little town XYZ and they say we're going to be a no-kill shelter, well, they got 2,000 animals there now this year, and they take care of them, and then next year they get 2,000 more. What do they do with them? You know, how can they be a no-kill shelter? There's always been, for many, many years, say if you just say in our community, there's been several 3,000 to 5,000 unwanted animals that come to the shelter.
Yes.
And so and it happens every year. So where do those animals go, and what's going to happen to them? You know, nobody wants them. So if everybody took care of their own pets and spayed and neutered them, or made sure they didn't breed, or found homes for the puppies or whatever, then they just wouldn't come to the shelter, and the shelter would just go out of business because nobody would bring anything in, right?
That's correct.
It's not like you're, you know?
Yes, yes, we don't breed them.
Yeah. So if you have a community, it never made sense to me. If you have a community that say it's a little town XYZ and they say we're going to be a no-kill shelter, well, they got 2,000 animals there now this year, and they take care of them, and then next year they get 2,000 more. What do they do with them? You know, how can they be a no-kill shelter? And what do they do with the animals that are suffering and dying? And do they just watch them die, or tell us a little bit more about the no-kill movement and this whole some of these buzzwords, the open adoption shelter, or a partially open shelter, or what are the different classifications there?
Okay. The no-kill movement started several years ago, and it started out in California, and people became convinced that there really was no overpopulation problem. There were just evil shelter directors that didn't want to find animals homes. And from that, the whole discussion changed from how can we decrease euthanasia to euthanasia needs to stop right now. In Danville, we could immediately become no-kill, and this is how we would do it. We would stop taking animals. And we're an open admission shelter. That means you could come from 4 hours away, and you could bring us a 10-year-old mangy chow, and we would accept that dog knowing full well that we do not have 20 people in line to adopt a 10-year-old mangy dog.
But at least that dog would be out of the cold and have a meal tonight and a place to stay.
That is correct. So when the movement began, the whole discussion changed, and people were focused on the incorrect things, and that is the bottom line, the live release rate. That's all that matters. And there has been a man-made percentage of 90%. If your shelter has a live release rate of 90%, then you can be considered no-kill.
Which means they go out of the shelter alive. They get
That is correct.
Adopted
or transferred. And but according to the no-kill movement, you do not have to count the animals that you turn away. You don't have to count the animals that die in your shelter on their own. You don't have to count any of that. You just count that live release rate. So our numbers, we are not no-kill. We have, though, here's another way of saying it. Let's say that we're at A right now, that the whole country is at A with a severe overpopulation crisis. Everybody wants to get to C, where there's no euthanasia having to take place because there's no overpopulation.
Right.
People are forgetting to go through point B, and that is lowering the number of unwanted births and making sure there's no cruelty in society.
Right.
So we've gone from A to C in some communities, and B still exists. There are too many animals, and too many are being cruelly treated. We have chosen to go through B, which is a slower way, but we have an aggressive spay-neuter program. We'll talk about that later, I believe. And we don't turn away any animals because why do we want them out on the streets? Why do we want them in homes that are suffering?
Well, from a veterinarian standpoint, I know our profession has worked. One of the things that the rabies vaccine is required by law, and we're very strict with that. We stay on top of that because you don't hear about people dying of rabies in America anymore.
You don't.
And that's because we've vaccinated a lot of animals, but we've taken the stray animals off the streets, which is a public health hazard.
Right.
And so not to mention it's not humane for the animals.
Right.
It's a rough way to live for a dog or a cat on the street, and it's a rough way to die as well. And they oftentimes, some of them are fat and happy and they live by a dumpster and eat out of some restaurant's food, but
Right.
they end up getting crushed in that dumpster one day, or they get
Picked up
backed
by a
over
fox.
or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So and so the thing that you alluded to is if we just close the doors to our shelter and then it would be no kill because we're not allowing anybody in. That's kind of scary because
Right.
what are people going to do? They're like, well, no one will take this dog. I'm going to let him out on the. I'm going to take him to the farm. I'm going to
Right.
let him out on the side of the road.
That's right,
you know?
because someone will take care
Right.
of him.
It's not my problem.
That's-
Somebody else will do it.
That's correct, yes. Lots of shelters closing doors. We get animals from all over. We've had people drive 3 hours to bring us animals.
Right.
And of course we accept them. Last year we took over 500 of our 2,500 animals from other localities because they had been turned away by other shelters.
Right.
And shelters have stopped. It used to be very common that a public shelter for a locality would offer euthanasia for owners who couldn't afford veterinary treatment and their animal is suffering. And we still do that. People can come, release an animal to us. We euthanize for free for them. And we count that on our numbers.
Right.
But one of the first things that shelters do if they want to go no-kill is turn that animal away. And in some cases, the poor animals then have the prolonged suffering until they die, or they're just put on the side of the road because some people think, I can't stand seeing my animal suffer, so I'll just put it out of my sight.
Yeah. And that's what I found is a lot of people can't deal with difficult issues, and
Yes.
it's a very difficult and ugly problem when you get down to see the actual. And some people just don't have the strength to deal with it, so they just put blinders up and they say, "I'm just going to ignore the problem, and then it'll go away." Well,
Correct.
it won't go away. Somebody else has to take up the slack, right?
Correct. Well, when I first started there, I would go home and cry every night. And finally, after about a month of that, my father said, Paulette, you have a choice. You can either find a way to be strong enough to do this, or you can find another job, and you have to make that decision. And I thought, well, I do love my job. Okay, I will find the strength then. But
Yeah.
it's hard. It's hard to see the things that you see. It's hard to see the things that I see.